So we're going to look in this lesson at The Spirit is Too Blunt an Instrument by Stevenson. It's a very curious title, so before we jump into the poem, I want you to just jot down a few thoughts about what does that mean? How can the spirit be an instrument? What does it mean, a blunt instrument? Does it remind you of any type of thing? You know, if you hear the words blunt instrument, what does it evoke in your mind? So you might just explore what you think she means by this. I remember being very confused myself by this title when I first heard about this poem. So even if you know the poem, you might still want to explore some of your own ideas about what this might mean. And then we'll jump into analysis. There's quite a lot of very precise imagery here, you'll notice if you read the poem. And much of these are kind of biological or medical terms, quite scientific terms. So you could say she uses a semantic field of science or something like that, or a semantic field of biology to kind of show precision with her imagery and her concepts. So she's being really precise. Which also relates to this idea that the spirit is too blunt of an instrument. So it starts, the spirit is too blunt an instrument to have made this baby. Again, you might see sort of a bit more of what does she mean by that before you read the whole poem. Because it's out of in copyright, I can't read the whole poem for you, so you just pause me for a second and read the poem aloud. It's a bit of a difficult one to sort of understand straight away, so don't worry if you struggle a little bit with it, because we'll go into kind of exactly what it means in the next few minutes anyway. So yeah, pause me, read the poem aloud, highlight or underline anything that you think stands out as an image, and then we'll go through the poem in a second. So mainly what she's saying is that the spirit, the soul, or the internal thing that we have that makes us is way too crude and rough and not really precise or kind of skilled enough to have made something as complex as another human being, a baby. So how can a human that is so, all humans, we're kind of imperfect beings, we're quite flawed, we're quite rough in what we do. How could we create something as miraculous as a human being, as a baby, full of all these kind of strange biological phenomena? Human passions are primitive, and how could they create something as perfect as a baby? We're just kind of simple and animalistic, and then suddenly a baby is born. I mean, obviously it's slightly more complex than that, but that's the way that the poet conceptualizes it. It's strange that we would have sort of like, crude primitive feelings, and then that turns into passion, and that turns into something as complex as a baby. And the baby is perfectly balanced. So there's bones and, there's a lot of fireworks suddenly outside my window. So if you hear fireworks, sorry. But yeah, bones in harmony with tendons, knee, knuckle bones, ganglia, vertebrae. So these particular precise words that she's using show, how miraculous and complex and intricate the human form is, and how it seems strange that something like an average normal human would be able to construct something that amazing. So yeah, lots of listing of very, very precise, detailed features of the human body here in order to get across just how complex and amazing and interesting humans are, and how strange it is that a normal average human can create this, that we have that capacity to create life in all its complexity. So in the final stanza, she says, tell me of a human impulse that, portrays any level of accuracy. All our impulses and emotions are vague and kind of random. They're not precise and accurate. So this is someone with a very analytical, scientific, precise mind who doesn't think that, our emotions and impulses are anything like as precise as they would need to be to create something like a baby. So it's kind of strange that we're so kind of rough and random and irregular, but we create something so perfect as another human. So yeah, it's quite an interesting idea. I've never really thought of it this way myself. So this is one of those examples of poems where I really don't agree with the poet, which is interesting because it gives you a really different perspective on the ideas of the poem. So if you ever find yourself reading a poem and thinking, actually, that's not how I think of it, that's a good thing. It's good to have your own personal response. The easiest ones to do that with is when they're really spiritual, because everyone usually has a strong opinion on spirituality and they're either very spiritual or not at all. Like people are agnostic as well when they're on the fence, but generally people tend to have a strong response to spiritual poems. This one's kind of like an anti-spiritual, more pro-scientific, kind of worldly, earthly, mundane poem. So yeah, I personally, my own framework, the way that I think about the world is quite different from the poet here. But I find it interesting to think of humans in this way, in a more biological, like material, physical way. So yeah, there is kind of like a wonder that the human body is a masterpiece, and humans don't even understand their own selves. Like we don't even know our own bodies. We need doctors to tell us what's wrong with us or fix us, you know. So there's a sense of like lack of expertise from the point of view of a human when it comes to understanding the workings of the body, yet a perfect capacity to create another human body and create life. So there's a skeptical attitude being expressed in this poem. She's skeptical in that she doesn't quite trust or believe that it's possible, but it is, and it is time and time again. So the human body is a strange, peculiar, and complex creation. And humans themselves seem so rough with their, the way that they are, that it's odd that we can create life. So definitely write your own beliefs on that. Do you agree or disagree with her, and why? There's a lot of techniques being used here, but most of them are not actually too poetic, again, because it's quite a sort of scientific, practical poem. The main thing you want to pick up on is this scientific register. So there's a lot of biological terms that are practical, to show that the speaker actually does have precise anatomical knowledge, that they've considered this phenomenon in a lot of detail. The form is more complex, I think, than the language in this poem. So it's free verse, which means there's no set rhyme or meter. There are 3 equal stanzas, so even though the rhyme and meter is not set, the stanzas are quite regular as well. And there's direct address, so the speaker is directly speaking to the reader, asking us to consider this same strange thought that she's had herself. There's some interesting kind of dissonances, like clashes of mood. I think there's sort of a pessimistic mood about, being skeptical and doubting the capability of humans, but also a positive mood about how complex humans are, or how wondrous nature is, and how wondrous life is as well. So a lot more form and structure points for you to look through in detail there. You can always download these documents from the Scribbly page as well if you go to scribbly.com. So yeah, she is a poet who wrote a biography of another poet, Sylvia Plath, who's one of my all-time favorite poets. And she kind of became interested in poetry herself, and then wrote her poetry sort of after being a biographer. So she's first someone who's interested in poetry and poets, and then after that someone who tries her hand at writing poetry herself. So this was written in 2005, very recent compared to a lot of poems, and she was 72 at the time. You might write down a few notes to yourself about, does that change anything about this poem? Were you kind of thinking of it from a different angle? Like, did you think it was a young speaker, for example, who was scared of motherhood? Or did you think it was a young speaker who had their whole life ahead of them and they were kind of not sure of themselves? Like, usually by 72, people's kind of spiritual and personal questions are sort of answered, I think. So I think it's quite amazing that she's quite old and she still has this curiosity about life and where does life come from and how are humans made. I think that's quite an impressive aspect to her character. So it's stark, brief, and simple, which is kind of typical of this writer's own personal style. You might, if you're interested in poetry in general, want to read a few more of her poems to get more of a sense of her personality. And especially these ones where she started to go deaf. It's quite interesting. In the 90s, she lost her hearing and then, wrote poems about that. So that's kind of interesting. You can also compare and contrast her poetry with Sylvia Plath's poetry as well. So there are, if you read this poem and then you read Plath's poems, there are kind of like echoes in the tone or the way that she describes certain things, but also really big differences as well between her and Plath. Mostly I'd say Plath is a lot more spiritual and not so scientific, I think. So we should kind of, I think, get a sense of humbleness and gratitude from this poem, that it's amazing that we actually, all of us have the capacity to create life, or humans in general do. And the idea that, nature works in this kind of very special, mysterious way is quite impressive as well. But there's also a sense of the fact that the human soul is imperfect, crude, rough. Humans are, at times difficult to understand, or irregular, or immature, impulsive, or animalistic. Like we don't seem precise and refined enough to be able to do something that seems like scientifically it would be very hard to do, like create a human. So it's kind of interesting, that opinion, I think. And the closing line is quite difficult and quite interesting because it changes the tone a little bit, I think. So if you have time, reread the poem now that you understand it more, and go back to the final line and think about what does she mean there, because she is sort of changing her opinion a little bit, I think, by the end of the poem. So I really recommend doing these tasks as well. So there's one about doing kind of mind maps on a couple of the themes, just to sort of explore it further and do some essay preparation with analysis. And then there's a couple of exercises as well that just help you go a bit deeper into the sort of precise techniques of the poem as well. And when you're ready, you can write some essay plans and try one or two of these questions here as well at the end. Be interested to know what you guys think on this one as well. Like if you have a similar response to me, or if you really agree with her and you kind of have a similar feeling. So if you feel like randomly emailing me your thoughts on this one, feel free to. You can do that with any poem, by the way, because I'm always really interested to know what people think. If you're looking for like full courses or downloadable documents, or kind of more support with lessons, you can always go to scribbly.com as well, because that will give you access to a lot more of our content. Thank you very much for listening. Hopefully you found this one thought-provoking, and hopefully you enjoyed it too. I'll see you guys soon in a future lesson.